everybody, and welcome to our session today entitled Exploring the Granularity of Corporate Travel Recovery. Much has been speculated about the timing and the scale of corporate travel demand recovery, and estimates offered by many people, including no less than Bill Gates, with a forecast of a permanent 50% reduction in demand. Let's hope that that doesn't materialize as the reality. However, our friends at McKinsey have undertaken a thorough study in multiple geographies on a segment-by-segment basis, and our session today explores the results and implications for the global travel ecosystem, albeit the data is based on a lot of US-focused research. Airlines, TMCs, hotels all need insight and understanding of the recovery in demand and how to be in the right place at the right time to gain as much benefit as possible. Our session is structured to present key findings and have a short Q&A style interview with the opportunity for participants to follow up with questions later. So it's with a warm CAPA Live welcome to the McKinsey Travel Practice Leader, Vik Krishnan, who's also the leader of the McKinsey Deep Dive and report into the forecast, shape, scale and speed of the likely corporate travel demand recovery. Welcome, Vik. I'm going to turn this straight over directly to you to really overview the background to what our corporate travel industry has been through from what seems to be now the dizzy heights of 2019 and where collectively we fell during 2020, and then start to delve into your forecast for the status of recovery and where our suppliers, indeed the travel ecosystem in total, should expect to help them plan their capacity, right size aircraft, et cetera, across the ecosystem whilst remaining nimble and in constant dialogue with customers. So Vik, over to you.
Thanks, Martin. Good morning to you, or good afternoon, given your time zone. And glad to join you for this conversation about corporate travel recovery. A number of our clients have asked us about our thoughts in the recovery of this part of the travel segment, which is, as you know, lagged leisure in the ongoing air travel recovery journey that seems to be quite robust in countries like China, a bit, starting up in North America, a bit behind in Europe, but then we do expect the summer to look a heck of a lot better this year than it did last year, at least for leisure travel. Corporate travel looks a little quieter. So if you step back for a second and think about business travel broadly, pre-COVID was nearly a $1.5 trillion market. China and the US comprised roughly half that number. The growth was a pretty healthy 5% per year. And so this was a very attractive market to be in. And if you actually looked at this from a supplier vantage point, some of our airline and hotel clients relied on corporate travelers for up to 3/4 of their actual profits. So while they weren't necessarily the majority of passengers on their aircraft or in their hotel rooms, they were incredibly profitable. Right? If we go to the next page, it's clear that corporate travel was never monolithic, though. Right, there are huge variations by travel category. About 60% of spend is on air, with the rest on hotels and other. And then there's also a huge variation by use case or occasion. So the reason why you get on a corporate or a business trip, nearly a quarter of corporate travel pre-COVID was actually spent on internal company meetings, which might surprise some people, but it was actually the number one reason that people got on airplanes relative to a few of the other reasons you might occasionally get on a plane. And then if you look at the mix by sector, there was a relatively even split between manufacturing and the industrial sector, or service-based companies, right? Service-based companies in particular, banks, consulting firms, accounting firms, et cetera, represented about half of the spend, while manufacturing environments represented half. All of this is relevant because when we think about recovery, the pace at which these types of companies recover might look very different. So, Martin, as we all know, 2020 was a disaster, right? Global corporate travel spending contracted 52%. In fact, when I first saw that number, I thought it was too low. But then if you sort of decompose that into, what happened in the US, managed travel, which represents, large enterprise, sort of very large accounts that travel quite a lot, that was down, contracted as much as 71% last year. And so the share of corporate travel spending of the total market in the US went from roughly a third to only a fourth, right? And that was quite a significant contraction across the board. And it was fairly devastating for the travel sector, not a surprise to anyone.
Indeed.
The $1 trillion question, right? Or $1.5 trillion question.
The one we all want answering on this call. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Is how much of this corporate travel is going to be permanently eroded as a result of meetings moving to digital or hybrid modes, or certain types of use cases or travel occasions disappearing altogether? And the answer is, frankly, no one knows. I mean, you alluded to earlier, Martin, certain shareholders and companies that own teleconference solutions say that 50% is the number. Airline CEOs say it's 10%. You would expect them to say it's closer to zero. And the Wall Street Journal appears to split the difference, right? And so the answer, the real point, though, is that there is a fair amount of speculation and still not a lot of fact to help actually back and try to understand how much corporate travel is going to be permanently lost. And so we've tried to put a little bit more detail behind that.
And in the research that I've been part of myself, along with others, I land in the middle. I'm with the Wall Street Journal on this one, and probably towards the mid to lower end of their range. But I'm certainly interested to know what you're going to say next about the recovery of the different segments, the purpose of travel type recoveries. And also, this is vital work that will help particularly the airlines and the hotels to plan what they do about where they replace capacity, how they think about where they should be targeting in the markets, and really the stimulation that's all important between the end customer at a pretty senior level and the suppliers themselves. So let me let you go on.
Yeah. No, and Martin, I think you raised a lot of important points, right? And the other element that's also quite important here is around what CFOs are thinking, right? So, a lot of CFOs are saying, my company effectively zero-based the travel and expense line item in 2020. And frankly, it would be fiduciary malpractice if those CFOs didn't critically ask, how much of that line do I really need, right? And so that's the other element that I think is going to drive a lot of how travel recovers. And
I think in that budget setting, we're pretty much done with 2021. People are starting to think about 2022. So, when travel managers and department budget holders are planning their travel budgets for next year, how much is the CEO and the CFO going to say, hey, hold up, you've just proven to us that you can still conduct business, particularly for internal meetings, without being there face to face. Maybe it's time for the cadence and the frequency to change. And that's where I think that in that earlier slide, that permanent loss of some form of internal travel is almost inevitable. It's a matter by how much is it going to give up.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think there's going to be some offset, for example, with companies that have embraced remote work. I mean, there are fewer of them than one might have imagined. That might actually require more convening, because in the past, everyone was at headquarters and now people are distributed. You might want to bring them together once a quarter or something like that. But that's probably not enough, honestly, to offset what might be a permanent erosion of some internal travel in 2022 and beyond.
Vik, any thoughts also on how much the HR duty of care role might have in continuing the slowing effect of travelers getting back on the road again? I mean, travelers might think that they're ready to travel, but will duty of care dampen the reality?
It's a good question, Martin. I mean, I don't see duty of care necessarily dampening the scale of corporate travel, but we do expect to see a higher bar for companies and their travel management partners in terms of what is effectively a track and trace of their employees, right? So in the past, the TMCs, the travel management companies, played a pretty significant role in helping companies understand where their travelers were. Now we have technology and devices that do that for you. We carry it in our pockets, so at least it tells you where your employees' phones are, even if it doesn't tell you where your employees are.
Where the body is might be different.
Yeah, exactly. And so there is a duty of care, a track and trace type obligation that companies are going to have towards their employees. They always had that, but the kind of focus on that has been accentuated during this pandemic, right? And so we also see, therefore, corporate travelers themselves saying, I don't mind. What I hear often is, I don't mind traveling again, but not to the extent that I used to before this pandemic. And we see corporate travel planners, the folks who help their employees get to where they need to in approved hotels and at the right cost. They also say they want to spend less on certain types of meetings, right? So, I think this is all it's contributing to, if we had to synthesize all of this, is is an era of significant uncertainty. While we might see a surge in corporate travel in the back half of this year, in fact, we see some of our hotel clients in convention markets getting quite excited about the booking profile, at least in the U.S. In the summer and into the fall. How much of that sticks and persists into 2022 and beyond remains to be seen.
I think that's a good point, and I think the need for communication, really frequent, good quality communication between those suppliers and their customers, either historical or potential, on what is happening at a granular, almost by traveler type, in companies thinking about how much of their volume will recover and where will that recovery be. I can't emphasize it enough, the essential nature of that.
That's absolutely right. And I think the other element that we would be remiss not to point out is the story around vaccines. So vaccines are the positive news story of 2021, right? As states in the US have ramped up the vaccine rollout, including through innovative lottery schemes. In the state of West Virginia, you could qualify for getting a shotgun if you like, for getting a vaccine through a lottery system.
I thought it was interesting when I first saw this slide, when you put this deck together, and already, this morning, that's already been updated with even better numbers. So the US continues to really move at pace and scale. And I know, our friends who are watching this in different parts of the world really follow the UK and the US in being the standout success of the major countries, and many countries hoping and trying to play catch up. And of course, our friends down in Australia and New Zealand lag far behind these levels of vaccination. And it's going to be essential if we're going to get borders reopened for international travel to recover. This is a really nice picture about the confidence of domestic recovery. But if we were to look at this on a global basis, it wouldn't be an even picture. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And I think, and to be candid, Martin, for all the hand-wringing about vaccine rollouts being at unequal paces of different parts of the world, the reality is that eventually the lag between rolling out a vaccine and getting to herd immunity, which is on the next page, is actually not dramatic, right? So the US is on a path to get some form of a transition to normalcy right about now, right? So it is already okay in the US to walk around, in most cities, most states, to walk around without a mask. We see offices opening up. We see people actually getting back to restaurants and going into cinemas and embracing quote unquote normal life in a way that has been occurring, of course, in countries like Australia and China. But in Australia and China, it's occurring with a very relatively stringent closed border system, right? Whereas in the US, we still, for the most part, have an open border. People can still fly to the United States with a COVID test, except from some countries, including in Europe. But with that, the fact that the US is actually transitioning towards normalcy is quite remarkable, and it really has everything to do with vaccines. Now, clearly, the UK is on a similar path. Europe is probably a few months behind, not substantially so, probably 6 months behind. But if you put that all together, we are on path in many large economies to getting to some form of herd immunity, or at least the possibility that COVID-19 is largely behind us by the end of this year, or in early first quarter of next year. Now, there's some headwinds, right? So there's more.
Vik, I think that's right. I think the travel within countries, and the ability to move much more freely is certainly gathering pace, fortunately, around the world in most countries. The EU have done a nice job, I think, last week 2 weeks ago, in announcing quite clear guidelines and measurements that will enable freer movement between countries within the EU and the EEA. The UK lags somewhat. Unfortunately, on Thursday they made an announcement that there would be no additional green zone countries added, and Portugal returned to amber, which makes traveling internationally from the UK much more difficult than within other European or within the European Union countries. And also we've got the US situation where we really need the presidential relief or release from 212, 215 restrictions before we're going to see large-scale intercontinental movement in travel again.
No, Martin, that's right. And some of these restrictions, very candidly, are no longer necessarily entirely grounded in science or data, right? So even if you have herd immunity, even if vaccine rollouts are proceeding at pace, some of these restrictions have actually proven to be surprisingly popular amongst the public, right? And so many politicians are in no hurry to necessarily lift these restrictions, because if you ask voters what they want, they're actually in many instances perfectly okay with not having large numbers of foreign nationals visiting for tourism or for business.
I agree, and I think the cynic in me says that some of these countries are slow off the block to be seen to encourage international travel again, because they perhaps want a summer of domestic spend at home to help their own GDP recover. So we're into some political scenarios as well, unfortunately.
Indeed. And I think that complicates what companies need to do, right? Because companies want to understand, how do they return to travel? How will demand patterns change? How should companies set travel policies? How much elasticity should suppliers build into their planning processes? Because what's also happening is that when demand does come back, in domestic demand lanes, or when restrictions get lifted, it is a deluge as opposed to a trickle. And so managing that can be really complicated. And most travel suppliers and players in the travel ecosystem aren't actually set up to handle that volume of demand showing up on a very sudden basis at scale, right? And that's proven to be quite a challenge.
Including the airports. And Heathrow Airport in London has been very clear that it would struggle with the lack of technology, lack of ability to read QR codes, for example, on vaccine certificates or travel certificates, that they're already experiencing anything up to 6-hour delays on certain days as they kind of tackle today's demand, let alone the potential for when this reopens. So we've got some infrastructure issues and challenges as well ahead of us.
Indeed. Totally agree, Martin.
But let you get back to this slide particularly.
Yeah, no problem. And I think we should actually go to the next page, which is looking at corporate travel and return archetypes. So we've segmented corporate travel into 4 archetypes for the return, right? So some travelers in sectors like oil and gas never left, right? It's hard to shut an oil well off and on. And so those travelers have been traveling, frankly, throughout this pandemic. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, about 1/5 of travel spend is in sectors that may not simply return at scale because, they're digital natives, or for many other reasons, as we discussed earlier, CFOs discover that they're able to actually conduct business in a relatively effective way without the travel and expense line item ballooning. But there's also a very large majority, about 2/3, in the middle. So there's what we call the FOMO, or the fear of missing out segment, which will rapidly follow whatever their competitors do or what their customers demand, or the cautious wait and watch segment, like government departments, who will be measured and very relatively cautious in their return to travel. There was on the FOMO segment in particular, I don't know if, Martin, if you read the American Airlines earnings announcement transcript in the interview last week, and they were talking about how they were doing a capital raise, and they had some investment bankers visit their headquarters in person to discuss the capital raise or the debt raise program. And the moment their competitors found out that there was Bank A was in Dallas, next week everybody showed up in droves, right? So that actually represents the majority of the corporate travel segment. It's about 60% in our view.
That's an ideal airline CEO story to repeat.
Indeed. And then if you decompose this further, even within these segments, there's a number of other vectors that we consider to be pretty important in assessing recovery. So there's proximity, so international versus domestic. There's travel purpose, which plays a role. And even, these segments aren't absolute. So even the never returning segment might very well make an exception for a large conference like CES in Las Vegas. And even the never left segment will likely cancel some trips, in part, Martin, traumatized by memories of those 24-hour journeys to attend a 2-hour internal meeting, sitting in the basement of an airport hotel with no windows, pretty lousy coffee and blurry eyes all around, right? No one wants to return to that.
At least if I join remotely, I can guarantee the quality of the coffee. But I think it is really important, this slide. And, we're not saying with this slide that it's 100% of these groups that are affected, that are going to do one thing or the other. they're going to do a proportion of this, as you've
Yep.
as you've highlighted. This is not an all or nothing chart, but this is a generalization of what we expect to see.
Indeed, indeed. So then on the next page, we actually have two examples. These are two McKinsey clients. One is a US multinational conglomerate that focuses on building products, and the other is a private health insurer. And for the first example, around a third of their 2019 travel was internal, right? And they of that third, they expect a third never to come back, right? And what has come back has mostly been board meetings, senior leadership sessions, and they expect to slowly add travel back between 2021, the fourth quarter, and the end of next year, right? And so overall, they expect their share of internal travel to remain roughly the same, but they think absolute spend is going to go down by 20 or 25%. Right? And all of the external travel they think of as being customer driven, and they think that a lot of that is going to be quite resilient, though they are seeing about 15% of their prior customer travel shifting to digital sales, inside sales. So a portion of that may never come back.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think we can use this as a proxy for a lot of other country-based customers. And
Indeed.
I think that point around communication and understanding the granularity around how this is built up, because that US-based multinational conglomerate, when you think about the internal meetings, that's going to the headquarters destination largely.
Yeah.
So airlines need to know that information around what forecast on my city pairs into the headquarters destination are going to be affected by that forecast downturn. So getting into that detail of conversation is important for the airline as much as it's important for the customer themselves.
Absolutely. And actually, that's a good segue, Martin, actually, into maybe we'll skip this page and actually go right to the next one, which is around what do players in the ecosystem do? And so we see four major themes that travel sector players, ranging from suppliers to GDSs and TMCs, need to consider as demand returns. So the first is, how do they leverage high frequency data and customer information? I think that was the point you just made around staying close to your customer. The second is around how do you redesign your processes to be a lot more agile? The third is around reassuring customers about safety and comfort. And the fourth is just better communication with the ecosystem, right? And so we have a number of examples of what could be done, right? So TMCs and OTAs might be able to help their hotel and airline suppliers with forward-looking views of potential choke points, right? I mean, to your point around the airports becoming a major issue, that's been known for a while, right? You go around many US airports now, they're as full as they were pre-COVID, yet 90% of the concessions don't appear to be open, and there's a 15-minute line for a Starbucks coffee, right? So it's clear that there's more work to be done across the ecosystem to improve communication. We also think that the airlines need to do a fair amount of work to upskill and prepare their labor pools ahead of actual demand recovery. In other words, you need your pilots trained, you need your flight attendants ready and available even before demand actually shows up as you scale up capacity. And that's proven to be more challenging than many airlines would have liked.
I was reading some comments from Alan Joyce, the CEO at Qantas, about the time it would take to reactivate the Airbus 380 fleet, which is parked in the desert long term. And he raised the point that it would take them 6 months to reactivate that fleet from it's well cared for and well tested environment that it's in, but to get that back into service, that's a long lead time. Yeah,
indeed. And that's true even for hotels, right? So this is a sector that has traditionally conflated, in-person service with high touch and high quality service. And in a world where we've all embraced digital self-service tools and e-commerce and ways of interacting with our computer and our phones more than we do with other humans, hotels are having to redesign a lot of their processes to rely on much less of a high touch, quote unquote, experience, right? And so there's lots of other examples we could work through if we had more time. But this clearly is a time of significant turmoil for our travel clients, and they're living in a world of unprecedented uncertainty. And what will separate those who are successful from those who are not is some combination of how they embrace some of these four themes that we have on the stage.
Absolutely, Vik. And can I thank you on behalf of everybody at CAPA, but also everybody that is listening to this session, for McKinsey and yourself for sharing the research that you've carried out It's vitally important to us. We look forward to seeing further updates from you from time to time. But I thank you for the session. We will be sharing a PDF version of these slides, folks. So look out for those being made available to you. And we will take questions from you as the session closes. But please do just submit those online. So for now, Vik, thank you very much indeed, and speak again soon, I hope.
Thanks, Martin. See you in the air sometime.